there's basically three things that I want to cover in this presentation today. I want to talk about what an employer of choice actually means, because it's a bit of a cliche. We tend to use it quite a lot, but I wonder whether we really know what we mean by an employer of choice. So I want to share with you what I think is an employer of choice. I then want to talk about the values that an employer of choice exhibits. So you could probably work out that my roadmap is very much a value-based approach. And I then want to talk about what the roadmap actually is. So there are basically three things out of this exercise today. Now, if you've got questions or comments or observations, I'd be more than happy to take those as we go through the presentation. So it's simply a case of clicking on the question button there on the right-hand side. Type in your question. I'll keep an eye out for it, and during the presentation, if I can see somebody making a comment or a question, I'll take it at that point. The other thing that I should point out to you is at the end of this presentation, you'll receive a copy of the slides, and you'll also receive a copy of the recording as well. So I'll make that available and send that out to you. So just relax and enjoy the presentation. I'll be throwing a lot of things at you, and I think that just absorb what you can, and then if you want to review it, of course, you'll have the slides or the or the recording to review as we go. Okay, now with in mind those three things, let's begin. So firstly, I guess the first question that I have for you is, what is an employer of choice? Or perhaps that might be a question that you have of me. But fundamentally, I'd like to think that the definition of an employer of choice is basically an employer of choice is a great place to work, and it reflects the changing needs and interests of both the individual, that is, the employee, and the organisation. So in other words, it's meeting both needs, the needs of the organisation and the needs of the individual, and they aren't mutually exclusive. And in fact, one of the things that I want to point out in this presentation is that those needs and interests can be mutually inclusive. And that's pretty much where I'm coming from in this presentation. So the question that I have is, why would we want to go down this road? I mean, a lot of organisations advertise themselves as an employer of choice. And when you scratch the surface, in fact, they're not really employers of choice. It's more of a marketing tool or strategy rather than a reality. So I want to talk about employer of choice as a reality rather than a marketing strategy. And obviously, if it's a reality, it can be a marketing strategy as well. It's interesting that I reflect on a comment made by Eric Schmidt many years ago when he was asked by a reporter. Eric Schmidt, of course, was the chairman of Google, and a reporter asked him the question, what's Google's competitive advantage? And expecting some sort of a response around technology, Eric Schmidt's comment was that it is a place that where we work on the culture to ensure that we attract and retain top talent. So his argument was that if we can create an organisation that attracts and retains top talent, then we obviously become an employer of choice, and that in itself is a competitive advantage. So much so, in fact, that Google, at the time that he mentioned this, received a million applications a year. A million applications. A million people knocking on the door saying they wanted to work for Google. And so his argument is that they'd never have a retention or recruitment issue with 100 people wanting to work there. So that's what we mean by an employer of choice. So why would we want to become an employer of choice? What essentially is the reason why we'd want to do that? Well, I guess it's all about, as I've mentioned, a place or a culture that's likely to attract top talent, and for those people that are actually there, they're more than happy to stay, so they're not looking over the fence at what the competitors are doing. Essentially, that's what the attraction is. And of course, it means that your competitors aren't poaching your top talent. It also means that there's high morale. It also means that there's a cost factor involved, because clearly it costs money to recruit and retain top talent. But obviously, if you've got a place that is an employer of choice, those costs are minimised substantially. So that's the reason or rationale. And I just thought this slide that'll come up very shortly is perhaps an amusing way of looking at this issue. That the old saying, and it's not my saying, but it is a true saying nevertheless, that the only rats that leave a sinking ship are the ones that can swim. In other words, the only people that are likely or capable of leaving are the ones that can go and get a job somewhere else. And often what happens in reverse is that the ones that perhaps want to leave stay. So really, an employer of choice is essentially about trying to keep our top talent, to make sure that they're engaged, that they're happy, that they're productive, and so forth. So that's essentially what we're trying to do in this organisation. It's true to say, of course, that you'll always have some degree of turnover, and some industries, of course, have got higher turnover than others. I'm thinking retail industry particularly. But what we're really trying to do is to minimise that so that we are retaining our top talent. Essentially, that's what we are on about. So I want to spend a bit of time on this slide, which is coming up right now, and just talk a little bit around what I believe to be the values of the employer of choice, and some of the values that are critically important in our journey towards becoming an employer of choice. Now you might say, well, where did these values come from? These are values based on my PhD research, and I went into an organisation to identify what the values were that were compatible with the individual and compatible with the organisation. So I was looking for the glue, if you like, that makes the employment relationship stick. So I want to just run through these briefly with you, because I think they're very relevant, and they are the linchpin around my roadmap to employer of choice. So on the left-hand side, you can see the old values, and these are values that are that have been around for, well, almost 100 years. These are the traditional employment relationship values that have been promoted by companies that have been successful in the 20th century. Unfortunately, there are, of course, a lot of companies that are still holding on to these values, when in fact we need a new set of values. And what you'll notice on the right-hand side is the new set of values. So these are the values that an employer of choice will exhibit. Certainly that's what my research demonstrates. So these are values that are not just in the interests of the organisation, they're also in the interests of the employee. So these are values that have an interest, universal interest in an organisation working in the 21st century. So let's just go through these for a moment. And while I'm doing this, you might like to think about your own organisation, and those of you who are consultants might like to think of those organisations that you consult to, and think about whether in fact the organisations that you are familiar with are actually exhibiting the old values or indeed the new values. So it used to be that by specialising, which is specialised employment, in other words, finding a niche, sticking to it, was enough to insulate yourself, both from an employer and employee perspective. But the trouble with that, of course, is that the world is moving so fast. We have a situation where once you've specialised in an area, all of a sudden that specialisation has changed dramatically. A typical example would be optometry. So when I left school, becoming an optometrist was considered to be a fairly secure career choice, essentially because the theory was, and the reality was as well, that everyone at some point in their life will have to wear spectacles. But now, of course, with the innovations around optical laser surgery, the optometry profession is now under pressure. So they've had to diversify into sunglasses and a range of different special, different services or eye care services. So the new theme is what I would determine or call flexible deployment. That is the ability to be able to use a skill set in a variety of different adaptive circumstances. And I think anyone that's successful in 2017 has mastered the capacity to flexibly deploy their skills. Look, I'm an example of this. I mean, I'm broadcasting this to you, whereas in the 20th century, obviously what I would have been doing is I'd be face-to-face with you in a classroom format. You'd pay a fee, I'd come in, I'd present exactly the same information, but of course now we can do this online. So I've been able to flexibly deploy my skill set to suit and meet the technological advances that have been made. And this is the critical core issue for organisations of the 21st century and employees too, I might say. So, for example, an engineer who might be a civil engineer now has to work on a multiple level projects and be able to deploy their skills in a range of different project formats. Internal focus was the focus of the 20th century. In other words, if we make sure our quality assurance was fine, in other words, if we make sure that we have a system and a process in place, then what we could do is we could pretty much minimize the errors that came out at the other end in terms of the service provision or the product that people purchase. But as we know now, customers are far more fickle than they ever were before. And what this means, of course, is that customers have more unique requirements than they ever did before. So this really entails an issue where we need to be customer focused. And I don't mean by customer focused customer service. I mean, that's old hat. Obviously, we've always had to provide customer service, but this is the thinking or the mindset that states everything you say, think and do in an organisation is or does have the customer at the forefront of your mind. So all decision making in organisations need to be very much customer centric. So you've still got a quality assurance process in the background, of course, but value adding onto that is a focus on the customer. A focus on the job used to be the requirements of the 20th century. So what this meant, of course, is that people had a small chunk of activity to do, usually 8 or so key result areas that they were accountable for, and usually in a work document called a job description. And basically, if you performed what was on that piece of paper admirably, you insulated yourself from the competition, and the organisation, of course, was happy from a performance perspective. Now, of course, things are so fluid and changing so quickly, we now have to have a focus on performance. And performance, of course, is far more than just what's on the piece of paper called the job description. So some of you who've been in my previous broadcasts would know that I have a very strong belief that non-job roles that people play in organisations are very, very applicable to performance. For example, you expect people to be team players. That's not necessarily written on the job description, but nevertheless is critical to success. So we've got to move away from the focus on the job to a focus on performance. Functional-based work was the building block of the 20th century. So in other words, people worked in certain departments or silos or specialisation. Now the focus is on project-based work. So the fact is that every time a project comes, we have a project to deal with, we have to manoeuvre and flex our workforce to accommodate that particular project. So organisations are now challenged with how they structure their organisations to be very agile and to be able to be manoeuvrable in a changing and unpredictable marketplace. Human dispirit and work. Certainly in my generation, which is the baby boomer generation, we would do anything that we were told. any job's a good job and you just simply hunker down and do what you're told. Now, of course, the focus is on engagement. I prefer to call it human spirit and work, but nevertheless, how do we engage the hearts and minds of people in the workplace becomes the new value set. And so this becomes critical. So no longer just giving people a job, paying them and expecting them to perform is the norm. We've now got to start to think about how we can engage that person in the work that they do in terms of their heart and mind becomes critical. The old concept of loyalty, finding a loyal employee was like gold in the 20th century. Now, of course, people are spending less than 2 years in the one job, studies show. So, people are moving much more. And so instead of focusing on loyalty, we need to focus on commitment. So knowing full well that people are only going to spend a small amount of time in this organisation, the question we really need to ask is how can we get them to commit to the organisational direction of the organisation, and at the same time, what can we do to give the employee what they need, which is essentially skills and attributes that they can take and work in their next job. So loyalty. The other problem with loyalty, of course, is that people are loyal, tend to be very much loyal to the systems, the processes and the ways organisations do things. We actually want people to question processes, systems and so forth. And, it's very difficult to do that if you're loyal to the organisation, because you're loyal to not just the organisation but the way they do business. Training. So training is normally done in a classroom environment where we have an expert standing out the front who is, sharing their knowledge and expertise with the people that are in the room. Of course, in this day and age, we need to move from a training focus to a learning and development focus. So, of course, we learn in a range of different ways, don't we? We learn on the job, we learn by watching people, we learn by being coached, we learn by being mentored. There are so many different ways that we can learn and develop ourselves in this day and age, is that we need to broaden our understanding of learning beyond simply training. And there's still too many organisations that see learning as simply sending people off to training courses and hoping, like anything, that some of that sticks and they come back and apply some of that in the world of work. So, and finally, the final concept is, or the final value is closed information. The typical thing that an employee would have been told in the 20th century is, if you don't, no news is good news, or if you need to know, you'll get told. Otherwise, you won't be told. So in other words, the assumption was that employees would only be told the information that they needed in order to get their job done. Well, of course, if we expect people to be agile, we expect people to be flexible, we expect people to be innovative, then we have to share with them a lot more information than we perhaps would have in the past. So we need to have a value of open information rather than closed information. So this becomes a critically important new value. So in other words, when in doubt, we need to tell people what's going on. People need two types of information. One, what's affecting their job, of course, but also what's affecting the industry and the particular vocation or occupation that people are in. So these are the 8 values that I base my roadmap on. I don't doubt for a minute that there are more than 8 values, and I'd be more than happy for people to add to my model, but certainly my research was able to demonstrate clearly that these 8 values on the right-hand side were in the interests of the organisation of the 21st century and the employee of the 21st century. So what I think you're finding now is that there is probably a lot of organisations, yours might be one of those, that's in flux between the old and the new. So you're still holding on to some of the old values on the left-hand side. A little bit confusing. You want to move to the right-hand side, but you're in transition between the old and the new. And my suggestion to you is to cultivate the 8 values that are on the right-hand side as a means of being able to create the blueprint, if you like, for an employer of choice of the 21st century. And it doesn't matter what industry we're talking about. These 8 values, in my view, are applicable right across the board. So, guys, if you've got questions or comments, by all means, go for your life on the right-hand side. I'd be more than happy to answer any of those questions that you might have, because I'm happy to be challenged on those. But I would argue that those 8 values on the right-hand side are critically important. So the question then is, how am I approaching culture? So a lot of people will talk about culture as something where we might introduce, free massages, or as great as they might be, or, we give employees perks and lurks and so forth, and that's our strategy to create this employer of choice. My suggestion to you is that that's a very superficial way of dealing with culture, because once you provide somebody with some sort of an extrinsic bonus, you have to continually up the ante because your competitors are probably doing the same thing. So I'm not sure that people they might be initially attracted to those sorts of perks, but I don't think they're sustainable. So my argument is that what is sustainable is the employment relationship. In other words, fundamentally what we've got to try and do is create what I would call a new psychological contract. We've actually got to create a new way that employees and organisations view each other, and to do this on the basis of both interests. And that's what these 8 values are about. So this is the framework, if you like, for creating this employer of choice that I'm referring to. So what I'm showing you on this screen, which will come up very shortly for you, is we're going to be, it's taking a little while to come up, I think. Yep, not there yet. Anyway, I'll talk about it and hopefully it'll come up. Essentially, what I'm referring to there is a psychological contract. Now, a psychological contract, 2 words, psychological and contract. Sorry, this slide doesn't seem to be appearing. It's sort of coming up. It's trying to make its way in. I think there's an animation on it, and I think that's the reason. And I'm not sure that I can get rid of that animation in short notice. But anyway, let me talk about it. A psychological contract, you'll get the slides later anyway. A psychological contract essentially is psychological, meaning it's in your mind, and contract meaning it's between 2 or more people. So essentially a psychological contract is a belief system that is in the minds of the employee and the organisation. So when an individual comes and works for you or me or anybody else for that matter, in their mind they have an expectation of what they can offer on the one hand, and also what they expect on the other. So for example, I might think, for example, I can offer a certain skill set that I can offer this organisation. So I'm prepared to offer that skill set, and I expect in return for that remuneration that is reasonable and fair. So that's a very basic level of what an employee would expect when they're working in an organisation. The organisation, on the other hand, would have certain expectations. They would expect that the employee, for example, would give of their best, would perhaps perform at their optimum level, and in return, the organisation would offer certain things for that organisation. So that's the contract. Now, the problem is the contract has been changing since the mid-1980s. So we've been in transition for a relatively short period of time. So since the Industrial Revolution over 200 years ago, this contract was pretty much stable. And then in the 1980s, what happened is there was a whole lot of downsizing. There were a whole lot of middle managers that were thrown on the scrap heap. And essentially what happened was that the people that were basically thrown on the scrap heap started to distrust the psychological contract as they knew it. In other words, they'd rationalise things like, I've given my life, working life that is, to this organisation, and now they've decided that they're going to throw me out onto the street. So people got very cynical about the old contract, and so it ushered in a new set of beliefs. And of course, we all know that millennials, when they come into the workplace, have a different set of values. And what's actually happening there is that those millennials are embracing a new psychological contract. And what we've got to do as organisational leaders is to be able to attract that new set of beliefs, is to actually do what I suggested on the previous slide, which is essentially to basically provide those or inculcate those 8 values that I referred to before, and move away from the traditional values that I mentioned earlier. All right, now I can see that slide's not coming up, so let's move on to the next slide, and let's see if we can get this thing up and running for you. I'm assuming I'm still being heard. Okay, good. It's sort of coming up. There we go. This is a very busy slide, and it can be a little bit off-putting, and my suggestion to you is to study this later on. I don't need to go into it, I don't think, in great detail, but what I'm really doing here is building the framework up. So I shared with you a slide or two ago the 8 values and the shift from the left to the right. So what you can see on your screen now is the new psychological contract as I've described. So over on the left-hand side, you can see the 8 values that I mentioned earlier, and I've defined those, so I won't go into those again. But what you can see in the middle column is the expectations that of employees. So these are the expectations that managers expect of employees coming into an organisation that exhibits this new psychological contract. And on the right-hand side, you can see the expectations that the new employee has of management based on the new psychological contract. So in other words, this is how the contract or those 8 values actually play out in reality. So let me just give you one example so that you can kind of grasp onto it, but I won't go through them all. We don't have time for that, but I'm more than happy to talk with any of you about this or explain it to you if you'd like me to do so. So if you take the first value there, which is flexible deployment, you'll notice that the expectation on the employee is a willingness to work in a variety of organisational roles and settings. So the organisation will expect employees to be able to be flexible, manoeuvrable, to be able to work in a variety of settings and teams, work in, with a different set of expectations around a whole lot of projects. So that's the modern expectation that an organisation would have an employee. Now, of course, it's a two-way street. So the expectations of management from an employee who happens to embrace that value is that they would expect that the organisation would encourage them to do so by providing them with training, with providing them with guidelines and incentives to be able to work in a variety of different roles. So you can see that if the employee brings that expectation to work with them and the organisation has that expectation, then what happens is that we have a value being played out in the organisation of flexible deployment rather than specialised deployment, where people say, this is my department, I'm not interested in what happens beyond this little patch of where I work, and frankly, I'm not interested in contributing any more than specifically what's on my job description and what I was employed to do, which of course is the old contract. So you can see, in order to create an employer of choice, you actually need employees who are attracted to these new values. And so the problem is, if you have a traditional employment relationship, what actually happens is you're actually attracting the sort of people that you don't necessarily want to attract. So if you have a traditional employment relationship model or an old psychological contract, you're actually attracting to people values such as specialised employment. So it's even harder for you to create a culture which is what we refer to as a employer of choice. So obviously by creating a culture like this, you are likely to attract a different sort of person, a person who perhaps embraces these 8 values. But you might ask, well, where do you start? It's a chicken and the egg situation. Well, I guess the organisation's got to start working on creating a culture that is likely to give expression to these 8 values. And by doing that, you're likely to attract the sort of employee that you're after. And of course, your good employees would pick this up immediately anyway. So if you think about your stars and your teams, you think about the people that really you want to hold on to, I'll guarantee they're already exhibiting an expectation around what the organisation wants, which of course is what's in that blue column there. So that's the framework, that's the model, if you like, of how it works. And, obviously, beyond this brief broadcast, I go into more detail around how you might do that. But the purpose of this is just to give you the roadmap so that you can see how you might move towards becoming an employer of choice. Okay, moving right along. What I want to do now is share with you what I call, at least, the corporate culture change cycle, which is a bit of a mouthful, but what I want to share with you is what I believe to be a process that certainly has been very successful for me, working with organisations both in the public, private and not-for-profit, where we were able to change the culture to basically exhibit those 8 values. So let's talk about the roadmap. This is the roadmap, essentially, I'm sure you're here to understand. So let's go through it carefully, take our time, and of course, if you've got questions, please ask. The first fundamental step in the roadmap is that what we do is we create a replica of the organisation. I don't mean a pilot. What I mean by a replica is we define a small project team. Now, I would suggest to you that the project team could be 8 to maybe 12 people. I wouldn't be suggesting that you have any more than 12, and any less than 8 probably isn't really going to be representative of the organisation. So what you're trying to do, and it's not as easy as it might sound, particularly those of you who come from large organisations, what you're trying to do is to get a small, scaled-down version of the organisation. And what that essentially means is, let's say you've got 12 people, then clearly you're going to have less people in supervisory and managerial roles in that project team than you would have employees. So the closer this is aligned to what the organisation, it's sort of like how we have, for example, health and safety committees. Health and safety committees, of course, have been in organisations for a long time because it's a statutory requirement. And what we attempt to do in health and safety committees, of course, is get representatives from every section of the organisation so that we can, get a very good handle on some of the issues affecting organisations. So this is not dissimilar. So we need to create a project team. Now, we want people on this project team who are willing and able to work towards developing a new culture. So these people perhaps need to be tapped on the shoulder. I don't think it's just a case of sending out an email and hoping, like anything, that people nominate. I think you've actually got to go out and get these people on board. So the very first task is to define a workplace sample or a project team that is fairly representative of the organisation. It'll never be totally representative. But the last thing you want is to have this too top heavy. You do not want to have in this project team, for example, 5 senior managers, or even five middle managers, and because what you're doing is you're not really representing the organisation. You're just simply putting this in as a managerial team. So certainly I can help you with that if you're interested in knowing more about that. So once we've defined the sample, the next step is that we need to measure the culture of the workplace. We need a starting point. So what we do is we invite everyone in the organisation to complete a survey, and I know you're probably groaning at this point thinking not another survey, but we need to start somewhere. We actually need to understand what the culture of the organisation is right now. So what happens is we invite everyone in the organisation via email to complete a survey. It's not terribly onerous. It's 80 statements. And in those 80 statements, and I'll show you some examples in a minute of what they look like, but those 80 statements, there are 10 for each of the 8 values I mentioned earlier. So what I'm really asking people to do is to make a comment about the psychological contract that I've defined to you earlier in that busy slide with, the expectations that the organisation have of individuals and individuals have of organisations. So we're basically creating, if you like, a benchmark. We need to understand, how closely we are aligned with those 8 values, as I mentioned earlier. And what you'll find, and I've done this in enough organisations to know, that you'll find that in some cases you're travelling quite well. In other cases, there's a lot of work to be done, but that's the point. It pinpoints where the work that needs to be done actually is. So we get people to complete that. We want a good result from that survey. I've had cases where I've had 86% of people responding to that survey because it was sold well to the workplace. And I use my project team, which I've defined in step 1, to be kind of like the custodians, to go around and make sure that people understand that there is a body of work that really is very important for them to be guided and informed about the work that they do, because essentially it's the project team that is going to actually help to develop this culture. Okay. Step 3. Now, once we have got the survey data, well, that's really what step 3 is to create the data. And I'll show you some examples of organisations that I've worked with. And we basically create a report. And what the report shows is how closely aligned individuals and managers are to the values that I mentioned earlier in the slide. All right, so once we've got that data, the next step is that we went a little bit far there, I'll go back one. We create the project team. Well, I guess you've already created that because I've talked about that. So we now have a 2-day workshop, and day 1 is doing some maintenance work. So we do some team development for this project team because they're going to have an important job to do in this organisation. So we need to make sure, and in a large organisation, it's very likely that some of these people won't know each other. So we want to create a harmonious, productive working team. So we need to spend a bit of time developing that team. So we spend a day, generally speaking, it's best off-site. Normally have the CEO address the team and let them know what their roles and responsibilities are. And essentially, day 1 is to form the project team. Day 2 is to actually analyse the data. So, and normally I facilitate this process. So what happens is that we share the report with the project team, and I'm at pains to make sure that nobody else in the organisation has seen these data until the project team has seen it. So in other words, I've had cases where the CEO has said to me, "Oh, can you just give me a heads up? Can you share with me the results. And I've had to say to the CEO, well, I'm sorry, I can't do that, because, you know, the integrity of the process will be destroyed unless we allow the project team to do its work. They are the first people that need to see these data. So the project team works through that. Essentially, they're answering three key questions in the workshop. One, why are the results the way they are? Two, can you give some examples to demonstrate why the results are the way they are, and from your own perspective, of course? And three, what can we do as an organisation to shift the organisation from the old psychological contract to the new psychological contract? So their job is to put down some practical recommendations that need to occur in order for the organisation to shift the emphasis from the old to the new set of values. Now, obviously, there's a bit of educative material in there. I obviously talked to the project team about those 8 values that I shared with you before. They need to understand what we're aiming for. My experience has been that most employees get it implicitly. They understand the need to move towards those 8 values. And the reason they get it is because they understand that it's actually in their interests. But it's also, of course, as I said before, in the interest of the organisation as well. So once we do that, we move on to the next stage. I've kind of covered that, which is developing the team. And then we, as I've also covered, we develop some strategies. So what's actually happening is that we create 2 reports. The first report, of course, is the data that comes out of the survey, and that data guides and informs the project team to create a second report, which is essentially a culture survey report, which talks about some practical recommendations that need to be put in place in order to create a new employer of choice culture. Now, I then spend a good hour on the second day working with the project team, asking them where to from here. I want to empower them. I don't like that word. Enable them might be a better word. I want to enable them to make a decision about how they might take this information forward that we've worked so hard to get to. I usually have a scribe in the room, and the scribe collects all of this information so we don't have butcher's paper flying everywhere. We simply have somebody putting together the report during the 2-day workshop. So we develop this. Normally what happens is that the project team decide that the very best way forward is for the team to share their report with the senior team, because the senior team, of course, need to perhaps sign off on some of these recommendations. The next step is, of course, to implement these strategies, and that's where the management team comes in. We need to start thinking about some ways and means of making these changes to create this employer of choice, which is essentially an important part of the roadmap. Now, you can see that the model or the roadmap that I'm developing here is cyclical, and there's a good reason for that, because you can understand that the last step in the process is actually to monitor progress. So you can do this annually, or you can do this every 2 years. It's really up to you, and there's a whole range of factors that might determine whether this is an annual monitoring process or whether it's done every 2 years. What happens is essentially we're comparing the before and after. So what we do is it's exactly the same 80 statements. We invite everybody to be involved, and the process then is to actually compare the before and after. So we can actually see whether in fact we've been successful. So have we in fact created a successful change? Do we have measurable change? Are we moving in the right direction? Are these values much closer aligned to the model that I shared with you earlier? So let's have a look at some of the real life data that's come from some organisations that I've done some work with. What you're seeing on your screen, or will see shortly, is you can see that there are a number of circles there. I won't go into the methodology. I'm really just giving you an outline here, but essentially this is the big picture of the organisational perspective. The red circle represents top management, the yellow circle represents middle management, and the blue circle represents the workforce. And you can see that there some of those, and of course you can see the 8 values as well. So you can see in some cases the organisation is very closely aligned, and in other cases it's not. So really the ideal scenario that you want is one big white circle with a lot of pluses in it. And you can see in the area of human spirit and work, you can see that that's a great result. So on that value of human spirit and work, the organisation's done extremely well. So they don't need to do too much, but in other areas there, there is a fair bit of work to do. For example, there is a fair bit of misalignment between top management and the rest of the workforce in focus on performance. If you look up the top there, you'll notice that the red circle is out of kilter with the yellow and the blue circle. Now, obviously, it doesn't tell you any more than a quick snapshot about where, it's like a pulse, if you like, about how the organisation's operating. Let's drill that down a bit further and actually look at some data. Well, there's another way of depicting that, and there's a histogram. So we've got a couple of ways of representing the data I've just shared with you, as you can see. But if I show you some examples, have a look at this information here. Here's a statement in the survey. It's the 42nd statement out of 80, so that's why it's Q42 if you look up the top there. The statement says, I have recognised staff for great customer service. Now, that's the statement that workforce respond to. The statement that middle management and anyone that's in a leadership role would respond to is a slightly different survey question. Their survey statement would be, that's what the leaders respond to. What the workforce responds to is, my manager has recognised great customer service. So in other words, we're looking at it from both perspectives, both organisationally and individually. Now, what these data show you, and this is a real life example. So you've got over here top management. Top management agreed with that statement, but as you can see in the percentages, only 2 out of 4 agreed. 1 sat on the fence and neither agreed or disagreed, and then 1 disagreed. So, but it defaulted to an agree nevertheless. Middle management was a lot more positive about that, probably because they're at the coalface and probably they are in a position where they can probably recognise that work a little bit more. You'll notice that 41 out of 55 middle managers, which is quite a good result, 75% said, yep, I agree with that. 18 disagree and 7. Now, what happened to the workforce? You'll notice it's neither. You'll notice 35, 38, 27. So you've got a bit of a mixed response there. So the project teams, their job, their job is to actually work out why those results are the way they are. And what you're seeing below is a breakdown of departments, and so it can give you some sort of indication of what is happening across all those departments, so that you can kind of see where the sticking points are. You'll notice in DS it's probably more positive than in other places. Have a look at another one here. Here's another one. I have a multi-skilling program in place in my team. So obviously this is to do with flexible deployment. And you'll notice there that it's not very positive at the top management level. It's very much more positive at the middle and workforce level. And of course, is a very mixed response when you look at it from a functional point of view. WIS is probably the most positive in this sense. So they've given it 63. That's the workforce example. So again, the project team works through that and answers 3 questions. Why are the results the way they are? Can we give some examples from your own observations? And question 3 is, what can we do in order to improve on those results? Okay. All right, so that's pretty much the roadmap. I'm quite open now to take any statements or comments or questions that you might have. So go for your life. Perhaps while you're typing those in, I might just give a quick plug to 2 things. I've got a lunch and learn program coming up fairly soon, so you'll have to be quick. You can go to the website that is listed at the bottom there for more information. But the Lunch and Learn is essentially an opportunity for people who are in leadership roles to learn some fundamentals about leadership. It's pretty much pitched at middle management or even supervisory level, and it's done online. It's done where there are 6 modules, as you can see on the right-hand side, and each of those 6 modules, of course, are piped in once every couple of weeks for an hour-long session. So what people get for their money is 6 one-hour sessions on those topics. And you might say, why those topics? Well, they're just the topics that people have indicated to me that are critically important to leadership success. And they get a PowerPoint presentation for each of those, plus they get a video recording of each session if they happen to miss it. It's done over lunch, so it reduces the costs associated with travel and being out of work. So there are no opportunity costs involved necessarily. It's done over lunch. The other thing they get is a copy of my book, latest book, and they get time with me via email to talk to me about their success stories or issues that they've got in their workplace. So you might like to take advantage of that. If you are, then just get in touch with me and I will certainly be more than happy to give you more information on that. You can certainly get some more information just from the bottom link there. And finally, if you're really interested in what I've shared with you today, you might like to get hold of my book, Attracting and Retaining Talent, Becoming an Employer of Choice, which really does go into great detail what I've shared with you today. And you can get that information from the book. It'll show you examples of organisations. I've actually got a case study in the back. It'll talk about the values and some of the strategies that you can apply to create that employer of choice that I've talked about. So folks, that's pretty much it for me. If you're interested, then just drop me an email and I'm more than happy to send you out a signed copy of the book. Or if you want to sign up yourself or other people to the Lunch and Learn that's coming up very soon, be quick. Send me an email and I'm more than happy to work with you on that. It's a fairly simple process. So guys, that's pretty much it. And if you do have questions that you've thought about that you perhaps haven't asked now, then you know where to get me. So just send me an email. So thank you. And thank you very much for the time and opportunity to work with you. And I wish you all the very best in becoming that employer of choice that we've spoken about today. So thanks, guys. Thanks for your time.